The wind howled through the skeletal remains of what had once been home. Ayana Wachinhin Nujin stood motionless among the frozen corpses, his breath forming white clouds that dissipated quickly in the merciless Montana cold. Snow had begun to cover the bodies of his people, women who would never again tend the sacred fires, children whose laughter would never echo through these mountains, elders whose wisdom had been silenced forever by cavalry sabers and rifle bullets. His weathered hands, marked by 68 winters and countless sacred rituals, trembled not from the cold, but from a rage that threatened to consume the very foundation of who he had always been. The crescent-shaped scar on his forehead, earned in a vision quest decades ago, seemed to pulse with each heartbeat as he surveyed the devastation that Captain Jeremiah Stone's soldiers had left in their wake. Grandfather. The voice belonged to Takoda Najin, his grandson, whose young face bore fresh wounds from the 3-day massacre. Blood had frozen in his black hair, and his eyes held a fire that Ayana recognized all too well. It was the same flame that had once burned in his own heart, before years of seeking peace had taught him to extinguish it. 27 of our people are gone, Takoda continued, his words cutting through the wind like arrows. The women tried to shield the children. Old Meta was killed while praying. They showed no mercy, grandfather, none. Ayana's fingers found the sacred pipe hanging at his side, its smooth surface worn from decades of ceremony and meditation. For 40 years, he had been the voice of peace within their band, the one who counseled patience when younger warriors wanted to paint their faces and ride against the encroaching soldiers. He had believed, truly believed, that there was a path forward that didn't require bloodshed. The bluecoats came during the storm. Takoda's voice grew harder. They knew we couldn't flee. They knew the women and children would be huddled in the lodges, waiting for the weather to pass. Captain Stone planned this, grandfather. This wasn't the chaos of battle. This was butchery. The old medicine man Chulun emerged from behind a collapsed teepee, his amber eyes reflecting the grey sky above. Snow clung to his hair, which was adorned with sacred amulets that clinked softly as he moved. In his gnarled hands he carried something wrapped in buffalo hide. "The spirits are restless, Ayana," Chulun said, his voice barely audible above the wind. "They cry out for justice. The sacred hoop has been broken, and only blood can mend it." "I have spent my life teaching that violence breeds only more violence," Ayana replied, though his words sounded hollow even to himself. "The white man's God speaks of turning the other cheek. I thought perhaps there was wisdom in such teachings." Chulun unwrapped the bundle, revealing an ancient tomahawk. Its handle was carved from ashwood and decorated with eagle feathers and turquoise stones. The metal head gleamed despite the overcast sky, its edge sharp enough to split the wind itself. "This belonged to your great-grandfather, the one who fought beside Crazy Horse at the Little Bighorn," Chulun said. "He told me once that peace is a luxury the strong can afford. But we are no longer strong, Ayana. We are dying, one massacre at a time." Takoda stepped closer, his young face desperate. "There are 11 of us left, grandfather. 11. In 3 days they will come back to burn what remains and make sure none survived. We can either die on our knees, or we can die standing." The wind carried the sound of distant voices, English voices. Ayana's enhanced hearing, sharpened by decades of hunting and ceremony, caught fragments of conversation drifting from the direction of Fort Mackenzie, 3 miles through the pine forest. They were already planning their return. But there was another voice among them, higher, softer, a woman's voice. "Wait," Ayana said, raising his hand. "Someone comes." Through the swirling snow, a figure approached on horseback. As it drew nearer, they could see it was a woman with red hair tucked beneath a wool cap, her green eyes scanning the devastation with obvious horror. She wore the practical clothes of a frontier settler, but her movement spoke of education and purpose. "Dear God," she whispered, dismounting from her horse, "what have they done?" "Sarah Mackenzie," daughter of the fort's founder, had seen violence before, but nothing like this. Her medical training had taught her to compartmentalize suffering, to focus on what could be healed rather than what was lost. But this was beyond healing. "You shouldn't be here, white woman," Takoda said, his hand moving instinctively to the knife at his belt. "Your people have done enough." "I'm Sarah Mackenzie," she said, removing her hat and letting her red hair fall to her shoulders. "I came as soon as I heard. I brought medical supplies." She gestured to the saddlebags on her horse. I tried to stop them. My father built this fort to protect travelers, not to—" She trailed off, staring at the body of a child half buried in snow. Ayana studied her carefully. In her eyes he saw genuine grief, not the hollow sympathy he'd come to expect from whites, who spoke of regret, while their people continued to take and take and take. "You're Captain Stone," Ayana said slowly. "He believes this is justice." Sarah's face flushed with anger. "Stone answers to Colonel Matthews at Fort Shaw, not to the people of this territory. He's been pushing for months to clear the savages, his words, from the mountain passes. My father never would have sanctioned this. Never." "Your father is dead 6 months," Chulun observed, "and dead men cannot stop the living from their cruelties." "I know," Sarah said, tears freezing on her cheeks. "But there are others at the fort who feel as I do. Sergeant Kowalski, some of the newer recruits, they're horrified by what Stone ordered. This isn't what they enlisted to do." Takoda laughed bitterly. "And where were these good soldiers when our grandmothers were being cut down? Where was their horror when children were being trampled by cavalry horses?" Sarah had no answer for that, and her silence spoke louder than any words could have. Ayana walked to where the sacred fire had once burned at the center of their camp. The stone circle remained, though the lodge poles that had supported their winter shelter lay scattered like broken bones. He knelt and began to clear away the snow with his bare hands, ignoring the biting cold that turned his knuckles white. "What are you doing, grandfather?" Takoda asked. "I am consulting the spirits," Ayana replied. "Before I take up the hatchet, I must know if this is the path they wish us to walk." Sarah watched as the old man built a small fire using kindling from the ruined lodges. The flames took hold despite the wind, casting dancing shadows across the frozen ground. Chulun began to chant in the old language, words that seemed to carry the weight of centuries. "Wakan Tanka," Ayana prayed, using the sacred name for the Great Spirit. "Show me the way. My heart cries out for vengeance, but my spirit remembers your teachings of peace. Which voice should I follow?" As if in answer, the wind suddenly stilled. In the silence, they could hear the sound of approaching horses, many horses. Stone was returning sooner than expected. 12 riders, Takoda said, listening intently. "They're coming fast." Sarah mounted her horse quickly. "I have to go. If they see me here—" "No," Ayana said, standing slowly. The fire continued to burn despite the returning wind. "Stay. Be witness to what happens next." Chulun handed him the ancient tomahawk. Its weight felt familiar in his hands, as if it had been waiting all these years for this moment. The eagle feathers attached to its handle rustled in the wind, and the turquoise stones seemed to glow with inner fire. "For 40 years, I preached patience," Ayana said, his voice carrying across the ruined camp. "I told my people that the white man would learn to share this land, that there was room for all under the same sky. I was wrong." He raised the tomahawk above his head, and even in the grey light of the winter afternoon, its blade caught and reflected the fire's glow. "I, Ayana Wachinin Najin, elder of the Lakota, take up the hatchet not for revenge, but for justice, not for hatred, but for the survival of my people. Let the spirits guide my hand, and let the white soldiers know that we will not die quietly in the snow." The sound of horses grew closer. Through the trees, they could see the blue uniforms of the cavalry, led by Captain Stone himself. The man sat tall in his saddle, his blonde mustache frosted with ice, his cold blue eyes surveying the camp with satisfaction. "Spread out," Stone commanded his men. "Make sure there are no survivors. We can't have word of this reaching Fort Shaw." But his satisfaction turned to surprise when he saw figures moving among the ruins. Not just the Indians he'd expected to find dead, but a white woman on horseback. "Miss Mackenzie," Stone called out, his voice carrying the authority of command. "You have no business here. This is a military matter." Sarah didn't respond. Her horse shifted nervously beneath her, sensing the tension that filled the air like the charge before a lightning strike. Ayanna stepped forward, the tomahawk clearly visible in his right hand. Behind him, Takoda and the other survivors emerged from their hiding places among the debris. They were vastly outnumbered, but their faces showed no fear, only grim determination. "Captain Stone," Ayanna said, his English precise despite his accent, "you have murdered children. You have slaughtered women. You have broken the peace that existed between our peoples." Stone drew his service revolver, a Colt single-action army that gleamed dully in the winter light. "You're trespassing on territory claimed by the United States government. Your people were given ample opportunity to relocate to the reservation." "This land has been ours for 1,000 years, Ayanna replied. "Your government's papers mean nothing to the spirits of our ancestors who are buried in this soil." "Superstitious nonsense," Stone sneered. "You're living in the past, old man. This is 1876. The age of the savage is over." Sarah spurred her horse forward, positioning herself between the two groups. "Captain, there's been enough bloodshed. These people pose no threat to anyone." "Stand aside, Miss Mackenzie," Stone ordered. "These are enemy combatants, and they'll be treated as such." "Enemy combatants?" Sarah's voice rose in disbelief. "Look around you. You've just slaughtered an entire village, including children and elders. How can you call them the enemy?" Stone's jaw tightened. "They harbor warriors who've been raiding supply trains. This nest of vipers needed to be cleaned out." Ayanna laughed, but there was no humor in the sound. "Warriors? The youngest man among my people was 19 years old. The oldest was 82. We are healers, storytellers, keepers of wisdom. We have not raised a weapon against your people in 5 years." "Then explain the attacks on the wagon trains," Stone demanded. "Those were Crow raiders from the north," Chulin said, speaking for the first time since Stone's arrival. "But all Indians look the same to you, don't they, soldier?" Stone's face flushed with anger. "I don't have to justify my actions to savages or to bleeding-heart women. Sergeant Murphy, arrest Miss Mackenzie for interfering with military operations." A young sergeant with kind eyes and a troubled expression hesitated. "Sir, I don't think—" "That's an order, Sergeant." But Murphy didn't move. Neither did any of the other soldiers. They sat their horses in uncomfortable silence, their eyes fixed on the frozen corpses scattered throughout the camp. "Sir," said another soldier, his voice barely audible above the wind, "some of these bodies, they're just children." Stone whirled in his saddle to face the man. "Private Johnson, you signed up to follow orders, not to question them. These people are obstacles to progress, nothing more." Ayanna raised the tomahawk higher, its blade catching the last rays of sunlight that managed to penetrate the heavy clouds. "Progress," he repeated. "Is this your progress, Captain? Death? Destruction? The silencing of voices that have sung in these mountains since the world was young?" "Your songs are ending," Stone said coldly, cocking his revolver. "This is the natural order. The strong replace the weak." "Then let us test your strength," Ayanna said. What happened next seemed to unfold in slow motion. Stone raised his pistol, but before he could fire, Ayanna moved with speed that belied his 68 years. The tomahawk flew from his hand like a bird returning to its nest, spinning end over end through the frigid air. Stone tried to dodge, but the blade caught him in the shoulder, spinning him from his saddle. He hit the ground hard, his revolver discharged harmlessly into the sky. Kill them all! Stone screamed from where he lay bleeding in the snow, but the soldiers didn't move. They sat frozen, not by the cold, but by the realization of what they had become part of. Sergeant Murphy finally dismounted and walked slowly toward where Stone lay writhing. "No, sir," Murphy said quietly. "I think we've killed enough people for one day." Stone's face contorted with rage and pain. "I'll have you court-martialed, all of you." "Maybe," Murphy replied. "But I can live with a court-martial. I don't think I can live with this." He gestured at the carnage surrounding them. Ayanna retrieved his tomahawk and knelt beside Stone. The captain's shoulder was badly wounded, but it wasn't fatal. The old warrior had aimed with precision born of decades of hunting. "You will live," Ayanna said, cleaning the blood from his blade. "But you will carry this scar as a reminder of what happens when men abandon honor in pursuit of conquest." Stone tried to sit up, his face pale from blood loss. "This isn't over, old man. There will be investigations, retribution." "Yes," Ayanna agreed. "There will be, but not from you." Sarah had dismounted and was already tending to Stone's wound, her medical training overriding her personal feelings about the man. "The bleeding isn't too severe," she said, "but he needs proper medical attention." "Take him back to your fort," Ayanna said, standing slowly. "Let him explain to his superiors how he lost a battle against 11 survivors of his own massacre." Murphy helped Stone to his feet, the captain's face twisted with pain and humiliation. "Sir, with respect, I think our orders need to be reconsidered." Stone glared at the sergeant with hatred that was almost palpable. "You're all finished. Every last one of you." As the soldiers prepared to leave, Sarah approached Ayanna. "What will you do now?" "Stone won't be the end of this. There will be more soldiers, more investigations." Ayanna looked around at his ruined village, at the graves of his people that still needed to be properly honored. "We will bury our dead according to our customs. We will say the prayers that will guide their spirits to the ancestors, and then we will decide whether to fight or to flee." "There's a cabin about 10 miles north," Sarah said quietly. "It belonged to a trapper who died last winter. It's isolated, well stocked with supplies. If you need a place to rest, to heal." Dakota stepped forward suspiciously. "Why would you help us?" Sarah's green eyes met his dark ones without flinching. "Because what happened here was murder, not war. Because I've spent my life trying to heal, not harm. And because—" she paused, struggling with the words, "because I believe we could share this land if we could just find a way to see each other as human beings instead of enemies." Chulun placed a weathered hand on Ayanna's shoulder. "The spirits spoke through your aim, old friend. The tomahawk found its mark, but it chose mercy over vengeance. Perhaps that is the path they wish us to follow." As the cavalry rode away, leaving tracks in the snow that would soon be covered by fresh snowfall, Ayanna stood among the ruins of his world and pondered the weight of leadership in impossible times. The hatchet had been raised, justice had been served in its way, but the larger questions remained unanswered. That night, as they prepared the bodies of their loved ones for burial, Ayanna sat by the sacred fire and spoke to the 11 survivors, all that remained of a band that had once numbered nearly 200. "We stand at a crossroads," he said, his voice carrying the authority of generations of leaders who had faced similar moments of decision. "We can follow the path of war, painting our faces and riding against the bluecoats until we are all dead. We can flee to Canada, leaving behind the graves of our ancestors and the sacred places of our people. Or—" he paused, studying the faces around the fire. Young Takoda with his burning eyes, wise Chulun with his connection to the spirit world, and the other survivors who looked to him for guidance in this darkest hour. Or we can choose a third path. We can survive. We can preserve our ways, our stories, our connection to this land. We can be like the seeds that hide beneath the snow through the harshest winter, waiting for spring to return. What does that mean, grandfather? Dakota asked. How do we survive when they want us extinct? Ayana looked toward the dark forest where Sarah Mackenzie had disappeared, carrying Stone and his wounded soldiers back to their fort. Perhaps survival means finding allies where we least expect them. Perhaps it means learning that not all white faces hide enemy hearts. The fire crackled, sending sparks up toward the stars that shone with crystalline brilliance in the clear, cold sky. In the distance, a wolf howled, not with the cry of a predator, but with the song of a creature that had learned to endure through countless winters by adapting, surviving, remembering. Chulun threw sage into the fire, and the smoke rose straight up into the still air. The spirits are pleased, he said. You chose justice over revenge, wisdom over wrath. The hatchet was raised, but it was tempered by mercy. This is the way of true leaders. Over the following days, as they performed the burial ceremonies for their dead, word began to spread through the territory about what had happened at the winter camp. Sarah Mackenzie, true to her word, used her influence to ensure that the story was told accurately, not as a military victory over hostiles, but as a massacre of innocents that had finally provoked a justified response. Sergeant Murphy, haunted by what he had witnessed, began to speak openly about the need for different policies toward the native peoples. Other soldiers, men who had enlisted to serve their country but found themselves participating in atrocities, began to question their orders and their commanders. Captain Stone, recovering from his wound, found himself under investigation, not for his defeat at the hands of an elderly medicine man, but for his unauthorized attack on a peaceful village. The political winds were changing, slowly but perceptibly, and men like Stone were becoming liabilities rather than assets. But these larger changes meant little to Ayana and his small band of survivors. They faced the immediate challenge of surviving the worst winter in memory with limited supplies and no shelter beyond what they could build with their own hands. It was Sarah Mackenzie who provided the solution. True to her word, she guided them to the abandoned trapper's cabin, helping them transport their meager possessions through the deep snow. The cabin was larger than she had described, with a good stone fireplace, thick log walls, and a cache of preserved food that would see them through until spring. The trapper's name was Jonas Whitehorse, Sarah explained as she helped them settle in. He was half Cherokee, half Irish. He lived alone for 15 years, trapping beaver and trading with whoever needed supplies. He always said this cabin was a place of peace, neutral ground where red and white could meet without violence. Ayana examined the cabin with the eye of someone who had lived through many harsh winters. It is well built, he admitted. The spirits of this place feel calm, not angry or violent. Over the weeks that followed, as the Montana winter deepened into a cold so severe that even the wolves stayed in their dens, an unlikely friendship developed between the Lakota survivors and the white woman who had chosen to help them. Sarah visited regularly, bringing medical supplies and news from the outside world, but more importantly, she brought something that had been in short supply: hope. There are others like me, she told Ayana one evening as they sat by the fire, watching Dakota teach the youngest survivors traditional games. People who believe this land is big enough for all of us. We're not many, but we're growing. And what of Captain Stone? Ayana asked. Sarah's expression darkened. He's been relieved of command. The investigation found that he acted without authorization and in direct violation of treaty agreements. He'll face a court-martial in the spring. Justice, Ayana mused, but not the kind I expected when I raised the hatchet. Sometimes the greatest victories come not from destroying our enemies, but from proving that we're better than they are, Sarah observed. As winter gradually gave way to spring, Ayana faced another crucial decision. The other tribes were organizing, talking of a great war against the whites. Sitting Bull and Crazy Horse were gathering warriors, preparing for what they saw as a final battle for the survival of their people. Takoda, now fully recovered from his wounds, came to his grandfather with fire in his eyes and war paint on his face. "They are calling for all warriors to join them at the Little Bighorn River," he said. "This could be our chance to drive the whites back beyond the Great Water." Ayana looked at his grandson, this young man who had lost everything but his courage, and saw both the past and the future of his people. "And what do you think, Takoda? Should we paint our faces and ride to war?" "My heart says yes," Takoda admitted. "But my mind remembers how you chose mercy over vengeance with stone, how that choice led to changes we never could have achieved through violence alone." "Ndi," the old medicine man smiled, seeing wisdom beginning to temper the young warrior's rage. "The hatchet I raised was not just a weapon," Ayana said. "It was a symbol, a declaration that we would not disappear quietly into the night. But symbols can take many forms." That spring, instead of riding to war, Ayana made a different choice. Working with Sarah and the growing number of sympathetic whites, he began to establish a school where native and white children could learn together. It would be built on the site of the old winter camp, a place where death had once reigned, but where life would now flourish. The school would teach reading and writing in both English and Lakota. It would preserve the old stories and ceremonies while preparing the young for the world that was coming, whether they liked it or not. Most importantly, it would stand as proof that two peoples could live together without one destroying the other. When government officials came to investigate this unusual arrangement, they found something that defied their expectations: a functioning community where former enemies had become allies, where the hatchet of war had been transformed into the tools of peace. Years later, when historians wrote about the winter of 1876 in the Montana Territory, they would focus on the great battles, the famous defeats and victories that shaped the destiny of the West. But those who understood the true meaning of courage would remember a different story, the story of an old medicine man who raised the hatchet for justice, but chose to wield it with wisdom, proving that the greatest strength sometimes lies not in the power to destroy, but in the courage to build something better from the ashes of what has been lost. Ayana Wachinhin Najin lived to see his great-grandchildren graduate from the school built on the graves of his people. He died peacefully at the age of 87, surrounded by students of all colors who had learned from him that the true measure of a leader is not how many enemies he can defeat, but how many friends he can create from those who once stood against him. The tomahawk that had tasted Captain Stone's blood was buried with him, but the legacy of what it represented, justice tempered by mercy, strength guided by wisdom, lived on in the generations of children who learned that the color of a person's skin mattered far less than the contents of their heart. In the end, Ayana had found the answer to the question that had tormented him in those dark days after the massacre. True justice was not about evening the score or matching violence with violence. True justice was about creating a world where such violence would no longer be necessary, where the hatchet could remain buried and the peace pipe could be passed freely among all peoples. The elder of the tribe had raised the hatchet to bring justice for his people, but the greatest justice he achieved was in teaching the world that sometimes the most powerful weapon is the one you choose not to use.